back when I was about 16 years old. Because of my living situation, at least twice a month I'd have to make a 2-hour drive from a city area back to my parents' house in a rural area. I'd say about 90 minutes of that drive was just country road with nothing but valley corn or some other crop on either side, with the occasional farmhouse or something that you think people might go in and out of willingly along the way. Because of how used to this drive I'd already been beforehand, I didn't think much of driving. That long stretch of no cell service, no phone booth area, nothing had happened yet, so surely nothing would happen ever. Right in the middle of one of those drives back, while the night was slowly taking over, as I was driving, I saw a flash of light that was weird. Maybe just a momentary anemic moment. Another flash. Well, maybe someone coming this way has their high beams wonky or something. Another flash. All right. Something's wrong. I slow down a bit so as not to get blinded periodically and swerve off the road and try to figure out what was ahead. Further in the distance, I think I see a person actually multiple my eyesight's well and good at this time in my life. So I was putting 2 and 2 together, getting close enough to realize there were 4 people on this shitty country road lined up across it as if to make a roadblock to prevent any cars from passing through. Another note to this is that I don't see any car around them that they could have come in. Don't remember any farmhouses or sheds nearby either. The rest of this encounter felt like it took place in the span of an hour because of my anxiety, but it was likely no more than 5 minutes. In hindsight, I'm driving maybe 10 as I'm getting closer and realizing that I'm definitely, without a doubt, approaching a line of 4 grown-ass people with huge bright white masks on staring in my direction. 2 of them definitely have bats or some other distinctly long blunt objects, and 1 person is holding something that the flashes are coming from. I've seen enough horror movies and heard enough stories about crimes on roads like this to think in that moment, I only have 2 options: slow down and hope they eventually partway around my car, running the risk that they could very well get the jump on me in my dinky car, or pick up the pace and disregard whether or not they'll have the chance to move out of the way when I potentially accelerate through them. I decided the latter. I had no means to protect myself with other than a bat in the trunk of my own car. And at the time, I was a young teen who could easily get knocked down with a solid slap because of my build. And my car was shit enough to where if I stopped, I wouldn't doubt someone could break in with easy force. Now, hearing gravel and dirt kick up from under my tires, I was more freaked out at the potential I could drive myself off the road, along with taking out some strangers who I am now dead certain are carrying bats as I accelerate towards them. I'm proper freaking out, but I've accepted that this was the decision I made from the adrenaline of fear of any situation. I accelerated more, and thankfully, the 2 that were directly in my way lunged out just in time to not get hit. I stopped accelerating to catch my breath and see them in my rearview mirror. The other 2, for some reason, trying to haul us towards my car as if they could catch up. And it became so real in that moment that there were people who were intentionally trying to get the jump on me in the middle of fucking nowhere. Probably not just shit kids trying to get the kicks and giggles out of freaking someone out, but real adults trying to harm someone that came that way. I just focused on driving out of there as fast as I could. I focused on going forward, didn't turn the radio back on to distract me, and felt shook by the experience in general. The most fucked up part, honestly, was getting home and realizing that part of what I was driving on wasn't gravel. It was nails that were now embedded into my tires. Praise whatever God may be out there for me somehow having those sturdy tires. I didn't tell my parents the full story about what happened, and they just assumed I was being reckless and someone was playing a prank. I told the story to some of my friends and they told me I probably wasn't in any serious situation and they were just trying to get a scare out of me, especially since being in a car was a pretty big advantage in the situation, which I can't deny still creeped the absolute hell out of me. And I remember it every single time I drive down a road that looks any type of similarity. A few months ago, I was partaking in one of my many late drives. I usually just drive around if I'm stressed or go sit by the water to clear my mind, and it's a total mental health saver. Anyways, after about partway through my drive, I decided to go park at the entrance to a popular walking trail. I figured it was late so nobody would be there to complain about me blasting my music or relaxing in my car. Note that you drive to the trail by taking a narrow and bumpy dirt road, and the speed limit is 20 kilometers per hour, but it's full of massive potholes, so you usually have to drive pretty slow or you'll screw up your car. After navigating the narrow, pothole-ridden road like an expert pilot, I arrived at the parking lot in one piece, but much against what I expected. There were 5 or 6 cars spaced out along the parking lot's edge, and one closer to its center. This, on its own, isn't too out of the ordinary, however. It was close to 2 a.m. at this point, so I was a little creeped out, but it didn't really faze me. After I found a spot close to the middle, I noticed that none of the cars had any lights on, not inside or out. This was odd, as I'm pretty sure people don't usually go for group walks at 2 a.m. And if someone was sitting in them, you'd see the center console lights or something else light up at the very least. After all, who wants to sit in complete darkness? Not giving it much more thought, I cranked up my music and laid back while staring at the sky. Nothing happened until 20 minutes later. Like clockwork, car engines came to life and headlights cut through the dark. Each car, except for the one by the entrance, left in a line as if connected by a chain. At this point, I felt like something was off. It just didn't make sense. After seeing the line of cars leave, I figured I should head home myself, so I started up my car and began backing out of my parking space. As I did the last cars, high beams came on. This made it so that I couldn't see what I was doing, and it annoyed me, so I finished pulling out a little too quickly and went to the road. The other car followed. As I slowed down to avoid the potholes, the other car sped up. This continued until they were directly behind me. Keep in mind I still couldn't properly see as they left their high beams on. This freaked me out, so I decided to speed up drastically, and as expected, the car behind me did the same. At this point, I was traveling down the narrow road at about 60 kilometers per hour while gritting my teeth over all the expensive sounds coming from my poor car. But the car was still tailgating me. I began to freak out, slamming my gas pedal into the floorboard and attempting to speed off. But to no one's surprise, this didn't seem to shake them. We were no longer on the narrow road at this point, but rather a connecting road to the main one. I was scared. I needed to think of something fast, or I might end up on a milk carton or some missing person report. And that was all I could think about. Then I saw it. Up ahead there was a sharp turnoff onto an area that overlooks the water. Think of it like a deep shoulder that you can park in while facing the lake. This was the perfect place for me to loose the car behind me. As I got closer, I continued to speed up. I was traveling at well over 80 kilometers per hour. Then once I got a couple meters away, I slammed on my brakes and turned my wheel as sharp as I possibly could, almost ending up in the bushes. As I did so, the other car shot past me and continued down the road. I felt so relieved. After gathering myself, I pulled out and drove down to the intersection to go home. I was home free and coming down off of an adrenaline rush higher than the CN Tower. Finally the light turned green and I could go. But as I did, I saw the car driving down the side street that went to the water and it sent chills through my spine. What if I stayed there rather than driving back? What did these people want from me? I'm truly glad I never had the opportunity to find out. I live in a county that was pretty rural until the last 10 years. The biggest town in our county is pretty crowded now, overcrowded, and I hate it. I moved from there to the countryside. I like where I live, except it can be really creepy at night because for miles and miles it's dark without any street lights. One thing about this county is that the main roads always get backed up real quick. Either there's an accident or whatever, so it pays to go the back roads. The back roads, like any other rural place, are less populated, dark, and have lots of trees. Anyway, a few years ago, something happened that almost made me stop using them. I was driving home kind of late one night. I decided to take one particular back road that shaved off 10 minutes from my commute home. I was tired and had to get up early, so I was going fast trying to get home soon. This road is a little more populated than some, but it is super spooky in some stretches because there are huge trees alongside the road and their branches and leaves make a tunnel of sorts. So I'm zipping through and round a curve. Up ahead, I see what I thought was a giant garden flag. You know the flags that people put up in spring in their yards? Well, I thought it was a weird flag because it seemed like it was fairly tall and large and it was in the middle of the road. As I get closer, my headlights hit it and it's not a flag. It is a person, a lady. She was wearing a red fez. I live in rural Maryland. You just don't see a fez every day. A long, flowy white dress and an orange reflective sash across her chest. A little strange because she's in the middle of the street. As I drove past her, it got weirder. As dark as it was, as I drove by, I could see she was about 60, she had glasses, and I could see her bright blue eyes. She looked in my passenger window and she started doing this weird bounce thing. I thought she was going to try and get into my car. Mind you, I'm going pretty fast. I don't know what it was about her, but she freaked me out. I didn't think she would rob me. I really thought she was a soul snatcher or a skinwalker. I honestly didn't think she was human. I can't adequately describe how creepy she was. I sped past her as fast as I could. I kept glancing in my back seat to make sure she had not materialized in my car. I prayed, recited scripture, and kept watching my rearview mirror. It was spring, so a little warm, but I felt bone-chillingly cold. I finally make it home and I run in to tell my mom the story. I got in just as my brother was telling my mom about this weird lady he saw as he was driving. It was the same lady, but he saw her at the intersection from the highway and the back road, whereas I saw her further down the road. We both had the same reaction. She also tried looking in his car. She was also bouncing around when he saw her. He said there was a car in front of him that sped off when they drove past the lady. My brother was so freaked out that he won't travel that road anymore, even during the day. Eventually I found out that the lady lives in the woods. Apparently, at one time her family lived on that road. Her father was ill and she tried to take him to the hospital. He died on the way there, and she drove around with his body in her car for hours. I guess she has mental health issues, and I think she lost the house or got kicked out. I have friends that live off of that street, so when I was talking about it, they knew exactly who it was. I still go on that road, but I haven't seen her since. I do hope she's okay, but I really do not want to run into her again. I was in a very unhealthy and toxic relationship with my ex-girlfriend for a year and a half, almost 3 years ago. Yeah, we've been separated for about 3 years now. So here's my story. I met her on Tinder, and I'm just going to call her Emma for the sake of this story. I was 18 at the time and she was 26. We chatted on Tinder for like 2 or 3 hours, and then we decided that we wanted to hang out. She was like 40 minutes away from me, though, and neither of us had cars. So I asked my mom if she would take me to her house, and I sort of just told her I was going to a friend's because there is no way in hell she would have took me over there if she knew I was going to meet with a 26-year-old girl from Tinder. Within a half an hour of being there, she gave me an ecstasy pill. For those of you that don't know, it's like a club drug, a drug that you take at parties, and it's supposed to make you feel good and get pumped up. I had heard about ecstasy before, but I had never done it before at that point in time, so it was my first time doing it. We had a good night and we had lots of fun. So skip forward to about 2 weeks. I'm still at Emma's house. Pretty much the whole time I was there. We were just getting drunk and going to parties. I asked her to be my girlfriend and she said yes. We were pretty much already together, but just to make it official, I asked her. My mom didn't take it very well. However, she actually eventually accepted us being together. I think she was mostly just upset because she felt like I lied to her anyway. She had no idea about what's going on behind closed doors. She had no clue about the drugs and alcohol we were doing or any of that. Throughout our 1.5-year relationship, almost every single bit of it was toxic. It was toxic from the minute it started even. I would say at least 50% of the time. We were messed up on something. Whether it was alcohol, weed, ecstasy, you name it. There were tons and tons of other things that happened between us as well. But I'm just going to get to the main part of the story. Skip forward to the day we broke up. We got into an argument. She started accusing me of cheating, and she said that she went through my phone and read messages between me and a best friend of mine that I've had since I was like 12 years old. She was accusing me of flirting with her back and forth, and she kept saying that I liked this girl. She was just going absolutely crazy on me. She was throwing things all around in the house and breaking stuff. I tried my best to calm her down and I took her to our room because we literally had company over. My best friend was there, along with his girlfriend, and my dad and some of Emma's friends were there as well. We were just having a small party and we were all drinking and just having a good time. I was starting to get embarrassed by Emma's behavior, though, as my best friend witnessed the whole thing. Everybody else was outside, though, in the backyard by the fire, and I didn't want them seeing what was going on, so I tried to calm her down, like I said. When we got into the room, though, that's when she really lost it. She started hitting me and throwing things at me and threatening me with a kitchen knife that she picks up. She even started chasing me around the room with it. I ran outside and grabbed my dad to let him know what was happening, but then my dad and her got into a screaming match and she even threatened him with a knife. Eventually, my dad and I left with my best friend and his girlfriend, and I never saw her again after that. She's been trying to get in contact with me ever since we broke up. Even though she has a kid now and she's married, she still tries to talk to me, which I have ignored her every single time. I was a very depressed kid who got taken advantage of. I never touched a drug a day in my life before I met Emma, but as soon as I met her, she threw drugs in my face and took advantage of me by preying on my emotional trauma and my immaturity to the world. I had literally just turned 18 years old 2 weeks before I met her, and she turned 27 3 months after we met. She was practically 9 years older than me, which was most definitely a red flag in itself right there. Something that always stuck with me, though, was when I first met her, the first thing she said to me was that I was never going to see my family again. Maybe it was just a harmless joke, but thinking back on it now, given the circumstances of everything, I started to piece it all together. It's like she was planning this. She was seducing me with drugs and just purely taking advantage of me. I've been completely sober since the day we broke up, with the occasional drink or two with the boys at the bar, but that's it. I have a new girlfriend now, and we are in a very healthy relationship. When I was 22, I moved to a new city only 20 minutes away. I was pretty familiar with the area, but I didn't know anyone there. I moved because it was closer to my new job and to where I was going to start school very soon. I picked up this new part-time job being a bartender at a nearby local bar in town, which was literally only half a mile from my apartment. It was actually a good job, and I liked it there. For the most part. I would make anywhere from $180 and even up to $300 a night sometimes. I only worked 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. One of my coworkers, who was also a bartender, only worked on Fridays with me. I kind of liked him because he was really handsome and charming, and he was always a gentleman. He was my type and his name was Noah, but he had a girlfriend, so I never made any advances towards him out of respect for him and his relationship. But I kept my thoughts in the back of my mind. One Friday at work, I could tell he was upset and that there was something wrong because he wasn't being himself. I asked him if he was all right, and he told me that he was all good and that he wasn't sure why I was asking him that. He told me he was just tired. A little bit later, when I went outside for my break, I noticed he was outside as well and that he was crying. I asked him if he wanted to talk about it, and he ended up confiding in me. He told me that he was having a hard time and that he just found out recently that his girlfriend cheated on him. I gave him my condolences, and I asked him if he wanted to hang out after work in case he needed a friend to talk to in turn, which he pleasantly accepted. He came over and we got drunk and had a good time. But over time, the more drunk he got, the less I wanted to be around him, if I'm being honest. He kind of started acting hostile and passive-aggressive. But I let it go because I knew that he was really upset about his girlfriend. And then he ended up leaving shortly after we had our adult time in the bedroom. He came over almost every night after that, and at that point, we were pretty much together, like in a relationship. At least I felt that way, anyways. But our little relationship only lasted like 2 weeks, because the last time he came over, I saw a whole different side of him. At first, everything was normal, and we were having a good time, like usual. He came over to my apartment and we went for a late night walk on the trails, and we went swinging at the park nearby. I literally don't even remember what triggered our argument, but we both got really heated, and he ended up hitting me and choking me until I passed out, and he left me on the trails where we were walking. Some kid eventually came across me while riding his bike through the trails, and he helped me by calling the cops and getting me to safety. I later found out that Noah's girlfriend never cheated on him and that he had just been physically abusive to her the whole relationship, and it led to her breaking up with him and him not accepting the fact after. He just hates women. As far as I understand, as much as I despise him, I really hope that he gets the help he needs, not only for his sake, but for the sake of the woman he will meet in the future, too. I used to go out with this one girl named Layla. We were very close at one point in time, and we were together for a full 2 years, which was a long time for me, considering we were high schoolers and that most of my friends and their significant others wouldn't last more than 2 months at best. We ended up mutually breaking up for about a month, though, because we were both going to different colleges and at the time we weren't sure it was going to work. We were both living on campus and her college was a 2-hour drive from mine. So with going to school and working an almost full-time job, there was just too much going on and we didn't think that it would work out, plain and simple. I'm one of those people that needs time alone in order to be happy in my relationship, and I feel like that's pretty normal. Even though we were broken up with me working and going to school, I felt like I didn't have enough me time anyways, and we ended up getting back together a little over a month after we broke up. So basically we were going to try and work on a relationship after all. I really cared about her dearly, and I thought she was the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. So fast forward another month. I left campus to go visit my family for the week because I missed them and I wasn't used to spending large amounts of time away from them. My family and I are very close. I have 2 brothers, 1 sister, and of course, my parents. I'm the oldest of the bunch. So I'm sort of like the role model for all of my siblings. My family lives in your average suburban American home in a nice, calm neighborhood, and it was just nice to be back home. I told my girlfriend Layla that I was going home for 2 weeks to spend time with my family, and she was really happy for me and supportive, so nothing out of the ordinary just yet, but on my 3rd or 4th night at my parents' house, I noticed my girlfriend was starting to act weird. I could just tell there was something wrong by the way she was texting me. She ensured that nothing was wrong, but I knew deep down that she was lying. She ended up asking me if I wanted to hang out for the day, and I told her that I'd love to, but I already made plans to take one of my little brothers to the rec so we could go swimming and play basketball. That was when everything took a sharp turn. She started blowing my phone up with messages, and it got to the point to where I couldn't even finish reading a message before she would send another one, therefore not even allowing me to reply. So I just decided to turn my phone on silent and go on about my day. I figured she was just having a moment and she would calm down soon, but I was wrong. I looked at my phone about an hour later, And I kid you not, there were literally over 100 messages and 20 plus missed phone calls, and I had completely out of character for her and not something that she would usually do. She was having a complete mental breakdown for no reason. She told me she was going to commit suicide, and she accused me of cheating. I mean, the accusations were endless, along with all the messages. Like, some of these individual texts had, like, 3 or 4 paragraphs each. It was insane. I didn't even read them all because there were that many messages. I texted her back, and I kept it brief. I just told her she was overreacting, and I denied all the accusations because they weren't true at all. Anyways, when my brother and I got home from the wreck, I went to my bathroom in my bedroom so I could shower. When I got out, Layla was sitting on my bed with her arms crossed. I legit thought I was dreaming for a second, so I rubbed my eyes to make sure that she was really there. My parents let her in the house because they didn't have the slightest clue about what was going on, as I didn't think to tell them. Plus, I didn't think that Layla would actually legit show up to my house. I broke up with her right then and there, and I told her that she needed to leave. Then she threatened to tell my parents that I was physically abusive to her if I didn't sit down and talk with her, which was not true at all. It was a very horrible thing to lie about. She was being very manipulative, but I wasn't falling for it, and I knew my parents wouldn't believe her. Especially after I showed them the messages she had been sending me. So she showed up to my house against my will and was trying to gaslight and manipulate me into talking to her. It got to the point where I just had enough, and I had to have my dad get her out of my room and get her out of the house. My dad literally had to yell at her to get her to leave because he was arguing with her for over 5 minutes about her leaving. It was the most embarrassing thing that I've ever been through. As soon as she left, I blocked her on everything I could think of, and I haven't spoke to her since, nor have I seen her since I found out that she got with my best friend a week after we broke up. I feel like it was an attempt to hurt me or to get my attention. Either way, I turned a blind eye to the whole situation. As much as it really did make me upset, I wasn't going to give in and give her that gratification. I cut them both completely out of my life, even my best friend, because obviously he wasn't my best friend if he could do that to me. I've since made way better friends and I've been way happier. As for Laylo, though, I'm not so sure she could say the same. I've been getting random message requests from her on Instagram because she keeps making new accounts to try and reach out to me. One of the times she reached out, she actually apologized to me, and another time she was completely going off the rails, telling me about how much she hated me. It's just crazy because at one point, this was the girl I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. I just never saw her as the person that she truly was. I'm glad she showed me before we had kids or ended up getting married or something. I truly dodged a bullet there. This happened last year. I was hanging out with my friends on a Friday night. There were 4 of us over at my friend Dave's place. We were mostly just talking and playing some games. After a while, someone suggested that we go get some snacks since Dave didn't really have anything since I drove there that night. I offered to go to the grocery store and pick up some stuff. The store was only about a 15 minutes drive away, so it wasn't a big deal for me to make the trip over there. I got into my car and headed over. It was about 10:30 p.m. and the large parking lot in front of the store was basically empty. I parked in a spot a few rows from the front, right next to a large light post. I walked into the store, and when I did, I noticed that there was nobody there. There wasn't even a single employee that I could see. It was a big store though, and since it was late, I figured that the employees must just be in a different section. I grabbed some chips, a frozen pizza, and a box of ice cream bars, which was everything that the guys wanted. Then I headed up to the till at the front of the store. This store had those self-checkout machines, so I went to the closest one and paid for my stuff. While I was there, I saw a man standing outside through the large window next to me. He looked to be about 35 and had a black jacket with a gray hoodie underneath. He was just out there by himself, looking at me with an unsettling smile. Perhaps the creepiest part was that he was the only other person I'd seen since I got to the store. I felt very alone, and I was starting to get nervous about going outside. When I was finished paying, I looked up and the guy was gone. Feeling relieved, I walked out the large sliding door at the front of the store and headed back to my car. That's when I saw that the same guy was standing next to my car. He wasn't touching it or anything, but he was probably 2 or 3 feet away from my passenger side door. Like I said earlier, the parking lot was almost empty, so it was very strange that he decided to stand right there. He was holding a large bottle of Coke, which was almost empty. He took the last gulp as I was walking towards my car. As I got closer, I tried to pretend that I wasn't nervous, and when I approached, the man looked at me and smiled. I greeted him as politely as I could, saying something like "Have a good night." "I think you too," he replied. Then I simply got into my car and drove away. The man stared at me as I did. I felt relieved and just a little embarrassed that I had been so worried. It seemed in that moment that the man was just a friendly guy hanging around the store. Definitely a strange guy, but harmless, I thought. After a few minutes, my car stalled out of nowhere. I had about a quarter of a tank at the time, so it was very confusing. It was actually my father's car, and it was a 2-year-old Toyota, so it's incredibly rare for things like this to just randomly go wrong. I managed to drift over to the side of the street with my remaining momentum. Then I put the car in park and sat there for a few seconds, in bewilderment. Not more than 2 minutes later, a car pulled up next to me and stopped. The window rolled down and a man stuck his head out. It was the same guy from the parking lot who was standing next to my car before he smiled at me. "Hey, man, you stuck?" he asked me. "No, it's okay. I'm fine." I stumbled. "I can give you a ride if you want," the guy offered. Obviously, I refused, and I told him that my dad was already on the way. When I said that, he rolled up his window and drove off. In reality, my dad was out of town on business at the time, but I made up the lie to scare him away. My next move was to call AAA. When the technician arrived, I told him what happened, that my car just stalled out of nowhere. He popped the hood so he could take a look. He immediately called me over to the front of my car. He was holding some part in his hand. I don't know much about cars, so I didn't know what it was until he explained it to me. It was the fuel filter, and he told me it was filled with something like Coke or Pepsi. When he told me that, everything made sense. That creepy guy from the store filled my tank with Coke, then followed me, waiting for my car to break down. I still have no idea what would have happened if I got into his car, but I'm glad things never got to that point. This happened last week on a Tuesday afternoon. I work unusual hours, so my days off are on random days of the week. This has its benefits because I get to do my grocery shopping and other errands on weekdays when most people are at work or school. So when I go to the store, it's usually not very busy. I went grocery shopping and the store was almost empty. I would guess that there were less than 10 people in the entire place. I spent 15 or 20 minutes picking up all the things that I needed for the week. I usually only get 1 day off per week, so I stock up whenever I go shopping. After I was done, I walked over to one of the cash registers. There was a whole row of them, but only 2 were open. Since it wasn't busy, I approached the till and started placing my items in front of the cashier. That's when I felt a presence behind me. I turned around and saw a middle-aged man, probably 40 years old. He wore a dirty t-shirt and a green baseball hat with a scruffy beard. I looked at him in surprise because the other register was free, so he had no reason to line up behind me. I turned around and tried to ignore him, continuing to unload my cart. That was when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around again and the man was still there. This time he leaned in towards me and offered to pay for my groceries, then gave me a sly smile. My cart was pretty full and I figured that I had at least $100 worth of stuff there, so I was not comfortable taking a favor like that from a complete stranger. I tried to be polite, but refused his offer. I also made sure to insert some kind of comment about my husband, even though I wasn't him single. I thought that might deter him. When I said that, the man's smile changed to a frown and he walked away. I was relieved at first, and I continued paying for my stuff. Then I left the store. I was still creeped out while walking to my car, and I felt like I was being watched. Despite that, I got into my car and drove away. There were a few more stops that I needed to make on my way home. I had planned to visit my bank, so I drove there and parked my car. Then I walked in and stood in line. There were 2 or 3 people in front of me. While I was waiting, someone else lined up behind me. I turned around and it was the same guy from the grocery store. He must have followed me. I quickly turned around, pretending not to see him, but he instantly began trying to start a conversation with me. I tried my best to shut him down at every turn. I didn't want to be too aggressive and risk causing a scene. Eventually, it was my turn with the teller, and after I was finished with my business, I walked out of the bank. I cautiously looked over my shoulder as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and when I looked back, I could see that the man was following me. My fight or flight response kicked in and I bolted to my car, not looking back. I knew I needed to get out of there before the guy had a chance to get to his car and follow me. Again. When I finally got there, I frantically started my engine and drove away. When I turned out of the parking lot, I saw the man and he seemed to be yelling something at me, although I couldn't hear him. I still have no idea what that guy wanted with me or what he would have done if he caught me. I had been working at a small grocery store for several years. This story is about the creepiest thing that ever happened to me while I was working there. The store was open 24/7. That was mainly to give us a chance to clean the floors and stock the shelves for the daytime. But we were also open to the handful of customers who trickled in throughout the late hours. My shift was from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., so I was there all night. Mainly I would stock shelves for the next day, but I also had to work the cash whenever a customer would come in. Since it was the overnight shift, there were not many customers. The night manager was also there, but he would usually just sleep in the back office most of the time. There was a small couch back there, and he would make good use of it for the majority of the night shift. So I was basically alone for most of the time. It was about 2:30 a.m. and the store was empty, which was typical for this time of night. I was slowly stocking and organizing some shelves near the front when a tone rang throughout the store and the automatic door slid open. A man walked in. He was about 35 years old and wore a white dress shirt with black pants, almost like it belonged to a tuxedo, but he was missing the jacket. That was an unusual look for this hour. Most of the late-night customers are truck drivers, security guards, or other types of night shift workers, so seeing someone dressed like that was unusual. I turned to him and said hi. He just looked forward and kept walking, not even acknowledging me. That was rude, I thought. But I went back to my work and he disappeared down one of the aisles. I knew that I would eventually need to help him at the cash register, so I kept an eye on the till at the front of the store so I could check him out when he was ready. After about 10 minutes, I started to get suspicious, but I didn't want to be a bother, so I kept working. As time went on, I became more concerned. It had been at least 20 or 30 minutes now, and I was pretty sure that something was wrong because it rarely takes anyone that long to find what they're looking for. After I finished putting away the last of the items on my cart, I started walking up and down the narrow aisles of the store. I made my way halfway through the store and still didn't see any sign of that guy. As I continued, a cold chill ran down my spine. The store was dead silent. I would have thought that the man would be at least making some noise. I continued checking each aisle one by one, but the man was nowhere to be found. When I made my way to the last aisle, I was very creeped out. I took a deep, long breath before poking my head around the corner. My heart was racing. As I feared, the last aisle was empty. The guy was gone, and I had no idea where he was. If he had gone out the front, then I would have heard the tone that door makes, and there was no way out the back. Without setting off the fire alarm, I bolted into the office to get the manager. When I burst into the room, he was asleep on the couch as usual. I blurted out my story, and he looked at me like I was crazy. He managed to calm me down after a few minutes. By then, I convinced him to check the security footage with me. There were, of course, a few cameras throughout the store that were always on. We sat at his desk and checked the time when the man had walked in. Sure enough, we saw a well-dressed man enter the store just as I described. We followed him as he walked through the store, changing cameras as we needed. Our faces turned pale when we watched him walk to the back of the store and open the door to the office where we were sitting. We looked at each other for several seconds. Then I glanced over to the small couch in the room and could just barely see a black dress shoe sticking out from underneath. The man was there, hiding under the couch. The two of us sprung up from our seats and sprinted out of the store to the street. The manager called the police, and they arrived within 5 minutes or so. They arrested the guy and took him out in handcuffs. To this day, we never found out why that guy was hiding under the couch. It still creeps me out to think of what he would have done if we didn't notice him when we did. When I was 24 years old, I started working as a ranger at Zion National Park in Utah. And one of the things that they informed us about during training was to be wary of the weather. And that's simply because even though it didn't happen every time that it rained, flash floods were something that occurred in the park, especially in the areas with a lot of trails through the canyon's crevices. Now, even though they warned us to be wary of flash floods, for the first 4 years that I worked in the park, I had never actually seen one, and therefore, I never really understood the warnings. But when you see your first real flash flood, you'll understand why there's something that you should never joke about. I'll never forget it. We had closed one of the trails on a weekend in the middle of the summer because we were getting a lot of flood warnings, and that didn't go over well with some of the hikers that had come to visit on summer vacation. So for all of Friday and the first half of Saturday that weekend, a few of the other rangers and I kept having to go out to the trail to stop young hikers from trespassing because we kept finding out that they were using that trail. That all stopped when the rain started coming down on Saturday. Though sadly, at that time I was actually out on the trail looking for anyone that might need to be told that it was closed. Now you have to understand the trail itself was pretty wide, but it cut right through one of the smaller hills in the area and acted as a natural gutter for the rain. So all of the rainwater that was coming down the side of the mountain was essentially collecting at the top of the trail and running right through the canyon. And while you wouldn't think that it would end up having enough pressure to sweep you away, you'd be wrong. I'll never forget the moment that I realized that I had been on the trail longer than I should have. It had started raining about 30 minutes before I decided that the trail seemed clear from civilians and that I could head back to the station. And I'll never forget the intense fear that coursed through my body as I heard the sound of rushing water in the distance. I looked up the trail and could see a small layer of water rushing over the surface of the ground, and before I knew it, the water had reached me and kept flowing through the crevice. At first the water was only a little bit above my ankle and I actually started to calm down a bit. I figured that I could get out of that situation with no problem. But when the water level quickly started to rise, panic set in again. Within a matter of seconds, the water had risen above my knees and I could feel myself being pushed over. I tried to fight the force of the flood as best as I could, but by the time the water had reached my waist, it literally swept me off of my feet. I began to twist and turn as I tried to fight the water that had now turned into what seemed like rapids. And before I knew it, it was too late. there was nothing I could do to try to stop the flooding from taking me. All I could think of was to try to keep myself at the surface of the water and protect myself from hitting any rocks. Just as I had the thought though, I felt the bottom half of my body smash into a large rock structure that was underneath the brown, rapidly moving waters. The impact tossed me around as the water kept pulling me along with it, and this time I couldn't reorient myself. I had been forced under the water by the rushing of the rapids, and after spinning in circles, I couldn't quite figure out which way was up. And then bam, I smashed the back of my head on what I can only assume was the side of the mountain. Everything went black after that, and all I could think of was that I was dead. Thankfully, the trail opened up shortly after I had been knocked unconscious and the water level dropped enough for me to resurface, and I was saved by a nearby hiker that actually should not have been on that trail in the first place. After waking up in the hospital, I thanked the man for saving my life, and he explained to me that he had actually just managed to make it out the crevice before the water started to trickle by him. The only reason he was waiting there was that he didn't want to be swept away as I had been. Either way, I was very happy that he was there to pull me out of the shallow water and bring me to safety. My first year as a park ranger also happened to be my last. In fact, if I'm being honest with you, I didn't even make it a full year. But I wasn't the only person in my division that resigned that day. My partner filled out his paperwork as well, and he worked in the specific station for 4.5 years before I even started. To this day, neither of us can really explain what was out in those woods with us on the evening that we quit, but it was clear that we weren't supposed to be there. It was my first night covering the overnight shift, which was vastly different from our daytime routines for the most part. During the day shift, we all just waited in the station in case an emergency call came in, and that rarely happened. According to my boss, there was only one serious incident where campers had gone missing and they were out all night searching. Other than that, though, the night shift was pretty calm. Things changed on my fourth night on the job, though. You see, we got a call from one of the rangers that had just ended their shift, and they said that on their way down the trail to the entrance of the park, they spotted a bear in the area. And normally that wouldn't be an issue, but we had campers in the area that night, so it was me and my partner Mike's job to head up to the campsite and just give everyone notice. They didn't have to leave or anything like that because a bear in the area wasn't too uncommon. But it was our job to inform them just for their own safety. Let me tell you, walking through those thick woods at night is a totally different feeling than walking in the comfort of daylight. I could hardly see 7 feet in front of me, and that was with our flashlights on, and the sounds around me seemed to be almost amplified by the stillness of the nighttime air. Mike and I made it over to the campsite as quickly as we could. It was clear that neither of us wanted to be out there that night. And when we finally got to the campsite, we were surprised to see that it was cleared out. There was no one there, and it seemed like the campers had picked up after themselves pretty well. We were both a little irritated when there was no one at the campsite because we had walked all that way for nothing. But that anger quickly faded when we both heard the sound of something breathing very heavily. The sound was coming from our right side, but when we both pointed our flashlights, we couldn't see anything through the thick foliage. We both listened closely, and I began to strain my eyes as much as I could to try and see what we were hearing. That was when I heard Mike tell me that we needed to get back to the cabin as fast as we could. I asked him what it was, and he said that he didn't know. I didn't argue with him, and the two of us began slowly walking back toward the trail that would lead us to the ranger station. And the entire time we kept our flashlights fixed on the area where we heard the breathing come from. Almost as soon as we started moving, though, I could feel chills running through my entire body as the deep breathing noise slowly shifted to a low, guttural growl. Out of nowhere, we could have heard the sound of something running through the woods behind that tree line. And though we couldn't see it clearly, we could tell that it was very large. I remember thinking that it must be the bear that the other ranger told us about. But when? Before I could ask Mike what he thought about it, he said, "I don't think that's a bear." And in that very moment, another deep, guttural noise came from the direction that the large beast was running around in. Only this time, I would describe it more as a howl than a growl. I had never heard anything like it, and all I knew at that moment was that we needed to get out of that forest. Mike and I took off as fast as we could toward the ranger station, though we knew that it was at least a 4-minute sprint. And the entire time, we could clearly hear whatever it was following us. I'll never forget the sound of the animal's heavy footsteps as it practically ran alongside us in the woods. The entire time we were running, we figured that it was going to catch us and there would have been nothing that we could do about it. Thankfully, about 200 feet away from the cabin, Mike and I both heard whatever it was shift its course as it started running in a direction that was away from us. That night, we made it back into the cabin and tried for hours to figure out what it was that chased us. And when we couldn't figure it out, we both decided that it might be better to find a different job that wasn't anywhere near that ranger station. That being said, I had never found myself in a more terrifying situation than when I was patrolling one of the national parks where I worked. You see, it was my second week at that location and I was still trying to find my bearings and get a good feel for that area. And I asked if I would be allowed to camp out in the woods for a few days just to relax my days off and also so that I could walk around and get a better feeling for my surrounding. My boss actually loved the idea and said that it wouldn't be a problem. Even gave me a radio just in case I found something and needed to communicate while I was off the clock. My initial plan was to stay in the woods for the entire weekend and into the beginning of the week, but I ended up having to call it quits after the first night because of what happened to me. You see, it was around 10 at night and I was laying down in my tent getting ready for bed when I heard a noise out in the distance. I decided to check it out to see if it was an animal. But as I slowly crept out of my tent, I was surprised to see the light coming from flashlights in the distance. There were 3 of them, and they were heading in a direction that ran parallel to where I was camping. I figured that they were just campers as well, and although that wasn't technically allowed for civilians in that area, I figured that they probably weren't going to do any harm. So I had originally planned on leaving them alone. But just to be sure, I wanted to follow them back to their camp and check that they were in a safe environment. I tried my best to stay as quiet as possible as I followed their trail of light, but I was really surprised at how far they were walking. I must have been following them for about 20 minutes before they stopped. And what surprised me even further was that they didn't go to a campsite. Instead, it looked like they had built a small structure out of sticks and camouflaged it using leaves and branches. I mean, this thing was nearly impossible to see at night, and they led me right to it. That's how well hidden it was. Now, at that point, my plan was to simply go back to my tent and check it out in the morning. That all changed, though, as I went to turn around and saw a flashlight coming up from behind me. I had miscounted earlier, and there weren't 3 of them. There were 4. I heard the man who was walking up behind me yell out to me, "Hey, who's that?" He yelled in an agitated voice. And before I could even start running, I could hear the sound of the people in the structure shuffling around. I decided to take off as fast as I could back toward my tent. I didn't know what it was, but something was off about those guys. I'm glad I followed my gut and ran, too, because as I made my way through the dark forest, doing my best to avoid any trees, I heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots going off. I can only imagine that they were shooting in my direction, though I can't be certain. I ran the entire way back to my tent, which felt like it was at least 2 miles. And once I was there, I radioed the ranger station, and they sent a few of the guys out to get me. The next day, we all went back to the area where I had seen the structure, and although the people weren't there anymore, all of their equipment was. It looked like some sort of distillery. So we ended up calling law enforcement, who figured out it was most likely moonshiners. They said that I was lucky to make it out of the area with my life, because if they got caught, those guys could go to jail for years, and it's likely they would have killed me if they caught me. I'd been working the night shift at the gas station for almost a year. At this point, it's not the best job, but it pays my cheap bills. The hours are long and the work is repetitive. I thought many times about quitting and finding work somewhere else, and this incident was my breaking point. It was a typical night at the gas station. I had just finished cleaning off the pumps and restocking the shelves when I saw the headlights of a car pulling into the lot. It was an old beat-up car with tinted windows. As the car pulled up to the pump, I could see that there was only one person inside. He got out and started walking up to the door. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s. He had dark hair and was wearing a black leather jacket and looked like he hadn't slept in days. I greeted him with a smile and asked him if he needed any help. He didn't say anything, but just threw a 20 on the counter and went back out to fill up his tank. It was a bit rude, but that's normal when working at a gas station, especially late at night when nobody wants to talk. I watched out the window as he filled up his tank, but a couple of minutes passed and he was still there with the pump in his car. I knew he only put $20 in, so he had to have finished a while ago. I waited another couple minutes, then I opened the door and started to say something, asking if he needed any help, but he just got back in his car and drove away. I blew it off and went back inside the store, but as the night wore on, I started to feel like something was off. I don't know how else to describe the feeling. Nobody else was pulling in to get gas, and it was really quiet outside. Then I heard a noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like a box falling off a shelf. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the back of the store. As I turned the corner, there was a man standing there going through our inventory. He was tall and skinny and looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. I froze in fear, not sure what to do. The man turned and saw me, and for a moment we just looked at each other. Then he started to walk towards me, his eyes fixed on mine. I backed away, slowly putting my hands up as if to not mean any harm. But he kept coming towards me. I could smell alcohol in his breath, and I knew that he was dangerous. "Money. Where is it?" he said, slurring his words. I saw in one of his hands he had a switchblade, and with him being clearly drunk, I was really scared. I pointed toward the register and he pushed me back to the counter. As I was opening the till, the man wandered around the store, making his way to the liquor section. He stashed a few expensive bottles in his backpack, then came back to the register. I put all the bills we had on the counter. Being barely over. A man looked at it, then looked at me. "The fuck is this?" "I need more, man." He wasn't satisfied, but there was no more money to give. He flipped open his blade, waving it around and yelling at me. I was sure he was going to jump the counter and beat me to death, but then he suddenly swiped the cash and bolted out the door. My heart was pounding as I looked out the window, seeing that same beat-up car from earlier. The man got inside and they drove off. The police came a few minutes later, responding to the emergency button I pressed while the man was browsing the booze, but they weren't too helpful right away. Thankfully though, the cameras outside the building were able to pull a license plate from the car, and 4 days later I was informed that both men were caught. Apparently they were homeless and had stolen the car. They then went on a crime spree, robbing as many stores as they could, mostly just of alcohol and money. I feel pretty lucky to have made it unharmed because their erratic behavior sent one worker to the hospital after an encounter with them. A couple weeks later though, I quit my job and moved to work in the day shift somewhere else. I've worked at a graveyard for the past 15 years, most of those years being the typical graveyard shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. In my mind, working overnight had way more benefits than working during the day. Day workers had more to do, since more people would be visiting the yard. There would also be burials taking place a few times a week that need to be arranged. And above everything else, night shift gets paid an extra $2 an hour. I've seen a lot during my years working night shift, though mostly teens messing around, or the occasional drunk group of friends daring each other to walk through the yard. However, this night was different. I got to the small faculty building a bit early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I did all of the normal checks and precautions at the beginning of my shift. Afterwards, my only job is really just to drive around in a golf cart every so often and just make sure nothing's going on. I'd say I only encounter something once a month, or maybe even every other month. Anyway, the first few hours were normal. I drove around several times, then went back to the small faculty building to eat my lunch. I think it was around 2 a.m. when I went back out to do another round of the yard. As I got to the far end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously really dark, so I couldn't see much more than the general shape of a figure standing there. I drove up closer. I could tell now that it was a man standing on the outside of the fence looking toward me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to, so I turned and drove in a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to hop the fence while I was gone. But when I got back, after 30 seconds, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but it all looked clear, so I continued with my patrol. Going through the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I'd go slower just to pass the time. I went all the way around and decided to check back on the spot where I saw the man. I really didn't have anything better to do anyways. I started driving down there, and almost immediately I spotted the man again. He was inside the yard, standing on the gravel path. I drove up closer again, but the man didn't move. I exited the golf cart and started walking up to him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him. "Sir, you can't be in here. I need to escort you out," I said, but he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight rush of fear went through me. "Sir, I need you to come with me." I reached out my hand gently to tap his shoulder. As soon as I did, he whipped his head around to look at me. He just stared into my eyes. He looked full of rage. I took my hand away and the man turned around and started walking away. I got back in my golf cart, preparing to call the police. As I watched him go all the way down to the fence, he stepped over it and continued walking away. I was relieved, but still terrified. I drove straight back to the faculty building and went inside. It was a small, single-room security-type building, but I felt a lot safer and calmer inside. I sat down and caught my breath. In all my years, I'd never really been scared, because it was always just people messing around. But this was different. I waited inside for a while. I'm not sure how long, until I heard a bang on the door. I jumped out of my chair and stared at the door in fear. A few seconds later, they banged on the door again. These were aggressive knocks, not those of someone friendly. I had nowhere to go. I picked up the desk phone and called 911. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were here, but I wasn't going to risk it all to find out. After probably 3 minutes of them banging on the door, I heard them walk away. I still waited for the police to arrive before I opened the door. The following day, my manager was able to pull the CCTV security footage from the building. What I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered the building, the man I'd seen in the yard earlier walked up to the door. He stood there silently for nearly 15 minutes before he banged on the door. He was also holding something in his hand, but the footage wasn't detailed enough to make out the object. It was likely a small pipe or bat of some sort. The man was never identified, but I still worked the same job at the graveyard and haven't seen him since. I'm a receptionist at a local hotel and most of my shifts are overnight. I'm in charge of the front desk and my main responsibilities are to check in guests, answer phone calls and keep an eye on the security cameras. It's usually a pretty quiet job since our hotel isn't the biggest or busiest. This night, the hotel was mostly empty. There were only a few guests staying with us. I was sitting at the front desk on my phone when I saw a man start walking towards the doors outside. I stood up and greeted him when he came inside. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I need a room for the night." He was definitely high on something, but regardless, I checked him in and gave him a key to his room. It was standard to allow walk-in bookings when the hotel was less than 75% full. He started walking toward the elevators and I sat back down and pulled my phone out. A few hours later, I was sitting at the front desk when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was a thump sound, like a door trying to be forced open. I got up and walked around the corner to the end of the hallway. The man I checked in a few hours ago was standing there trying to open up one of our maintenance doors. "Can I help you find something?" I asked. He looked over at me with those creepy eyes. I asked again, but he just stared at me. I wasn't really sure what to think. Maybe he was really high and looking for the vending machine or something. I don't know. I didn't want to anger the man though, so I went back to my desk and forgot about it. A good amount of time passed with no activity, no sounds from any of the rooms, nobody entering the building or walking through the halls. It was around 3 in the morning and I did a small walk around the bottom floor just to keep myself awake and busy. As I got to the hallway by the front desk, though, I heard a very sudden loud banging coming from one of the rooms. I stopped and listened for a moment, then went up the stairs to the second floor, where I thought it came from. It was very quiet now, which made me somewhat nervous. I walked down the hall, hearing nothing, but when I reached the end, one of the room's doors was open. I listened again for a second before lightly knocking. Nobody responded. I cautiously peeked inside, unsure of what to expect. It seemed empty. I wasn't comfortable walking all the way inside, though, so I couldn't really look around, but I was sure nobody was inside. I closed the door and looked at the room. Number 12. That was the room I'd given to the man. I never saw him exit the building, though. I quickly walked back down to the front desk. I looked at all the security cameras we had in the lobby and outside the building, but the man didn't turn up. I jumped. It was the hotel phone. One of the rooms was calling. I picked it up. "Hello, how can I help you?" There was a woman on the line telling me about some man knocking on her door in the middle of the night. I apologized and assured her I would take care of it. I hung up and took a deep breath. I was getting really nervous now. I walked around the desk, but then again, the phone started ringing. It was someone else from a different room, this time saying he had the same experience as the other woman. Someone knocking at his door in the middle of the night. I called the police right away. I stood by the front doors until they arrived, just in case I needed a quick escape. Luckily, they came before anything happened, but they didn't find the man. Instead, they found a broken window in his room where he likely jumped out of. It was on the second story though, so I'm not sure how he managed to get away without some major injuries. Later, while the police were still searching, they got a report that the car he used to pay for the room was stolen. It's unclear what the man intended to do or why he was knocking on people's doors. I'm thankful none of them opened their doors, though, because this case could have been much worse if they had. In late October, I was enjoying a ridge walk in England's Peak District. The high ridge overlooked Lime Park with its hall where Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice novel was filmed in the 1990s. Only a few fellow walkers had passed by in the last 3 hours or so, and also a lone jogger going my way. It's nice to share the ridge and comment on the view or just exchange nods. Now 2 figures approached about half a mile distant, their outline catching the low sun, which was highlighting the hilltop, while the valley slopes gathered the evening gloom, losing sight of them as the path dipped. I knew we would meet as it wound around the hillside and straightened again. So imagine my surprise to see an empty trail stretching away. The The valley sides looked blank, without movement, and a high, dry stone wall bordered the other side, though this may hold the answer. So finding a ledge, I hoisted myself to peek over, only to see open moorland towards the country lane and a closed-down hotel. For them to be out of sight would have required the speed of a greyhound. There seemed only one way that these hikers could have disappeared, and that was to have done a quick turnaround and run like the wind. Even then, they would only just have reached the bend before I would disappear. But why? Both needing to use nature's bathroom at the same time was unlikely, so perhaps a more sinister motive was their intent. From the distance, the outlines were of two males who would clock me as a solitary walker on this quiet track, knowing it would lead me to them. Might they be waiting just out of view, setting up an ambush? Instinct advised me to skirt around by dropping down the hillside, but my pride did not permit. I picked up several odd-sized stones from the wall and carried on slowly, all the while focusing on a spot from where they may be. Should a face be peeking, then my apprehension would surely spiral and be confirmed. My ears pierced the evening stillness while I kept glancing down the hillside for a quick exit. A distant dog's bark came. Any dog now would be welcome, if only to be a distraction. About 20 yards off the bend I paused. This should still allow enough distance for a swift run. Although the strangers were obviously fleet on foot, it was likely that they must have realized by now that I was wary of them for having taken so long on the path and would make a move out of curiosity or impatience. But something made me move the falling light. I didn't fancy being up here in the dark wondering who was waiting for me. Keeping to the track's edge, my foot dislodged a chunk of gravel, though hardly making a sound. Was this enough to have alerted my perceived tormentors? I waited, gripping the sweaty stones and chucking one at the wall. The noise was disturbing in the quietness but provoked no reaction. Within 3 strides I was committed to the bend, my nervous energy now drained and replaced with calmness and a sense of detachment to face whoever may be there. The lifeless ridge stretched away into the gloom, mocking my fear, and relief came. This was followed by a weird feeling of being a victim of some sort of hoax. An annoyance too of having spent so much time and caution to cover only a few hundred yards. Without this delay I'd have reached the road home. By now I realized my fear was not entirely rational, though it remained a mystery where and how they disappeared in a couple of minutes. This ridge had no caves or hidden gullies, just open moorland. And if they fled, what was their reason? The valley's darkness was reaching higher onto the hill, although the sky was clear, and this was better than being in the woodland with disquieting night sounds. With my pace unhindered now, I arrived at about the spot where the strangers were last seen and must have seen me. Looking back to my previous position, I noticed a wayward marker there not seen before. Then realized why this was not a post but another solitary walker who, despite my vigilance, had reached the trail behind me and was gradually merging with the horizon's creamy glow as it walked away. This was odd, as to climb part way in the approaching darkness only to turn back really did not make sense unless the failing light was the reason. By now I'd had enough puzzling and of being up here. So I started jogging for about a mile along the descending path behind me. The outline of the hill was featureless and sharp against the night sky. A part of a relaxing walk had been disturbed, leaving me pondering whether these figures were somehow connected and them to me. These unanswered thoughts continued as I gained the road and completed the end. I've since returned to the ridge at an earlier time of day, though without any unusual sightings or clues to resolve my experience. Perhaps repeating the hike some late evening around dusk might offer up more. However, you may make your own judgment when I postpone this until in the company of a trusted dog. I'm a 32-year-old female, but at the time of this incident I was 26, and back then I would go for a jog a few times a week. My sleep schedule was pretty strange back then, so I would run late at night for work. I was a server and bartender, so I would often work late on the weekends. Therefore, throughout the week I would be up until 3 or 4 a.m., since that's what my body was used to. I'll have to admit, though, that I really did enjoy the tranquility of the city in the middle of the night. The empty sidewalk and deserted roads made for a great running track. There was a large park near my apartment where I would often go. It had a paved path and a large grassy section on one side. There was a small forested area on the other side. It was long, probably a few miles from end to end. There were several playgrounds scattered throughout the vast area. I would usually run there from my apartment, then I would go all the way from end to end, then turn around and come back the way I came. Although I did enjoy the routine, I'll have to admit that it did feel creepy at times. There's something unsettling about the night in general. Something about the darkness creeps most people out to some extent. I would guess that it stems from our fear of the unknown. Anything could be out there, covered by a shroud of darkness. I was running through the park one night at around midnight. The dim row of lamp posts provided hardly enough light for me to see the dark path ahead of me. It was a night like any other until I started to get a strange feeling. A feeling like someone was watching me. I figured it was all in my head, though, because I'd run this route many times in the past and nothing had happened yet. Also, this was not the first time I'd had this feeling. I still felt the need to be cautious, though. About halfway through the park, I saw someone else ahead on the path. This was unusual, but not unheard of. I would occasionally see other joggers out on the path. It would be a little scary to see them from the distance, because everyone looks like some dark, sinister figure until you get close enough to see that it's just another person. This one, however, gave me a bad feeling. Even as I got closer, I could tell that it was a man, probably 6 foot tall, with ripped jeans and a dark hoodie. What really struck me as I got closer was that he wasn't jogging. He wasn't even moving, actually, just standing there. I kept running closer, hoping it was nothing to worry about. When I was about 20 or 30 feet away, however, I started feeling seriously creeped out. He was standing in the middle of the path, facing me. He showed no sign that he was planning to move and let me pass. Not wanting him to know that I was scared, I stopped and jogged on the spot for 10 or 15 seconds. Then nonchalantly turned around and started running back the way I came. After about 20 seconds, I looked back. The guy was running after me, and fast. I was normally a strong runner, but I had pulled a muscle in my leg a week or so before, so I was taking it easy and not as fast as usual. Therefore, I had no confidence that I could outrun him. He was only 40 or 50 foot behind me, and I needed to make a decision fast. Without giving it much thought, I darted into the forest. At the side of the path, I could hardly see anything. Tripping over logs and branches, I made my way deeper into the dark wooded bush. Looking back to where I came from, I could see the dark outline of the man standing on the edge of the path in front of a lamp post. Seeing him there dispelled any doubt I might have had about his intentions. He didn't say anything. I stopped running and hid behind a tree. Not that I needed to hide. The darkness would have been enough. Then I quickly dialed 911. The man must have heard me talking to the 911 operator because he took off running soon after. I told them my story and they encouraged me to file a report. However, they did tell me that it was unlikely that anything would come of it, especially since I was not able to give a decent description of this guy's appearance. Apart from his clothes, I never really got a clear look at his face. As time would reveal, the officers were right and the guy was never caught. It was one of the scariest nights of my life, and I'm thankful to have survived. This happened when I was around 14 or 15. I grew up in the suburbs of a major city. My neighborhood used to be a forest. Before they put all the houses in, they left some patches of undisturbed forests throughout the neighborhood. There were hiking paths through most of them, and I would often cut through on my way home from school or from friends' houses. One night I was over at my friend Josh's place. We had a little get-together with a few of my other friends. We spent the evening watching TV and talking about whatever, just an average night. By the time I decided to head home, it was almost midnight. That was not a big deal because our neighborhood was really safe. I think I had only seen about 2 or 3 police cars around there my whole life. It would be about a 25-minute walk, so I would usually run in order to save time. I set off after saying goodbye to Josh and some of the other guys who were there with us. Other than 2 or 3 cars, the place was pretty much empty. The street lights were bright enough that I never really felt vulnerable, although I could have made it all the way home on the lit streets. There was a shortcut through one of those patches of forest that I mentioned before. It was dark, but I had my phone with me and I would sometimes use the light to get through the woods in the dark. I cut through there all the time in the light, so I had it pretty much memorized. Anyway, I would be in and out in 5 minutes, so I figured it was no big deal. I entered the woods and started running, holding my phone up with my right arm. I couldn't see anything of the well-worn path that I was following. I was about halfway through when I heard something rustling about 20 or 30 feet to my left. It sounded too big to be an animal. There was nothing larger than a raccoon in these woods. Besides, I'm pretty sure that it sounded human. That was strange, but not a big deal. I thought some of the other neighborhood kids would use that spot to smoke cigarettes or do whatever. I was curious, though. I decided to check it out, so I stopped running and started walking through the rugged bush. I took big high steps, crushing piles of sticks and dead leaves along the way. I must have been making a lot of noise myself. All of a sudden, I heard the distinct sound of a person running through the bush. Someone was there. The sound of his footsteps were fading, so I knew he was running away from me. A relief, I guess. I was still curious though, so I continued to the spot where I thought I had heard the original noise. After another 10 steps or so, I reached a small clearing. When the light from my phone hit the open space, I almost lost my breath. There was a shovel laying on the forest floor and a small hole dug in the ground beside it. Next to the hole was a black garbage bag, maybe a quarter of the way filled. It was tied up with a knot about halfway up. I quickly turned back the way I came, and as soon as I made it back to the path, I burst into a full sprint. I barged into my house and woke my parents. After I told them what I'd seen, they called the police. For some reason, they didn't consider it an emergency, and they did not investigate until the following day. I guess it's not technically a crime to dig a hole in the woods at night, but I thought the circumstances were incredibly suspicious. The next day I did return with the police, and not surprisingly, the bag was gone and the hole was filled. Therefore, there was really nothing we could do. Although I can't be sure that the contents of that bag were anything sinister, it's hard to imagine what else it could be. I kept an eye on the news afterwards and never heard anything about a crime in the area. I thought it might be someone from the city trying to get rid of evidence, but that doesn't make any sense either. There were more remote places to bury evidence where it would be less likely to be found. If I had to guess, one of my neighbors had a horrible secret. I may never know who it was or what exactly was in the bag, but there was someone among us who was up to no good. Perhaps the scariest part about it was that he might have seen me. At some point, everyone imagines being famous in their lives. A lot of people create this image in their head that being in the public eye creates for nothing but a fairy tale life. But that's far from the truth. Being under the spotlight in any capacity comes with a lot of drawbacks, one of which being stalkers and overly obsessed fans. One extreme case of this, an ex-radio host and DJ who was centered in Los Angeles, had a long, seemingly never-ending chain of emails from an obsessed fan. It started around 2005 or 2006, when the DJ started noticing a regular listener, someone who listened to the show every day and would call in on the request line from time to time. At one point, the listener won a prize from the show, and in order to deliver the prize, the DJ requested her email. And that's where things began. In order to be polite and cordial with the girl, he would answer all of her emails, and when Facebook started to become popular, he edited her back where she commonly liked and commented on his posts. This went on for a while, until one day the fan professed her love for him. The DJ rejected this advance in the most polite way he could. She seemingly accepted the rejection, and the DJ thought it would be the end of it. But it wasn't. In 2011, she emailed him a link to a blog that she was writing where she would post about him and their quote-unquote love multiple times per day. She followed him over to a new radio station and was religiously listening to his shows, assigning meaning to the musical playlist. For example, the song Marry Me by Train was popular at the time, and whenever that song would play on his show, she would blog about it actually being a marriage proposal from the DJ. She began saving all his photos from his social media and photos of other women in his life, like friends and girlfriends, and posting them to her blog with extremely hateful words. She'd make posts raging about him being a man whore, followed by another post not even 10 minutes later in a completely different tone, apologetic and soft, implying she may have bipolar tendencies. The DJ did his best to ignore it, even though by this point he was extremely creeped out. But as she again began emailing him, he tried more forcefully this time to get her to stop. But she wouldn't stop. The DJ started sending DMCA requests to her blog host from the photos of his that she had posted. The repeated violations got her blog shut down, but then she started emailing him. Instead of posting blogs, he made a filter folder so he never would have to see them, aside from occasionally peeking at the insanity in the folder from time to time. Just out of curiosity, years went by and he hadn't answered any of her emails after 2 of them, when he very adamantly told her to stop all communications and leave him alone. This continued for years, and in total she has sent him over 4,000 emails, all of which he's archived. The more recent emails have gotten very dark and violent in tone. In one of the most recent ones, she was threatening to find and hurt the DJ and happily go to jail for it. In another one, she listed the specific neighborhood in which he lived, which he worries she may have his address if she already knew what town he lives in. In an effort to stem the flow of information, he deleted all his social media accounts a while back, but she would still email him pictures he appeared in from his friends who had public profiles, as well as radio station photos that he appeared in. Most disturbingly, she sent the DJ photos of a shrine she had made of him in her home with framed photos of his social media that she had posted up on the walls, desks, etc. Being a DJ, his appearance schedule must remain public so she could technically find him working at nightclubs anytime she wants to. And understandably, he's freaked out and worried about his safety. After calling multiple attorneys, none seemed very interested in helping him with this matter due to his fear of facing the girl in real life or even being in the same room as her. He never went through with filing a restraining order. He also worried that on the off chance she didn't have his home address, the legal process would reveal it to her. To my knowledge, there was never any follow-up with this, and it's not known if the harassment continued or what route the DJ pursued, if any. But this is one of those extreme cases of how a fan's obsession could have a very negative effect on someone's well-being and mental health. If you ever check your spam folder in your email, there's a chance at one point you received an email with one of your passwords in the title, and inside the email would be threats of leaking your information, or worse, unless you paid a certain ransom, usually in Bitcoin. This usually happens when a hacker, or even often a regular user, will likely find this info by merely searching any of the numerous data breach databases available on criminal forums. In March of 2019, a 25-year-old man named Joe Albanese received a similar email to what was just described. It was titled his password that he used for every account that he had. This was obviously a cause for alarm, so he opened it immediately to read the contents of the email. This is what it said. Hey, Joe, all you really need to know is that I know your password and other personal information. I won't come after you, I won't harm you, as long as you send me a small amount of money, $5,000 in the form of Bitcoin. We're going to refer to it as a donation for a good cause, not as any kind of blackmail. My Bitcoin address is if you don't send me the money, bad things may happen. Don't even bother going to the police. This email is untraceable. Joe did some research and learned that these kinds of threatening emails are common scams and usually nothing will come of them. Still, Joe replied to the email asking, "What other personal information of mine do you currently possess? I'd love to know." He sent this as a sort of challenge to the email, not even really expecting a response or for it to even go through, but it did. and he promptly received a response back saying, "I know your home address is EV. If you go to the police, I will know about it and you will be sorry." This is when worry would really set in with just about anyone, as having a password leaked in a data breach is one thing, but some unknown person having your home address threatening you with it is completely next level. Joe didn't reply to the email for several days, but he also didn't go to the police. He decided to wait it out and see what would happen next. And after 3 days, there was a follow-up email saying, "I'm still waiting for the payment. I won't wait much longer." Joe replied this time saying, "I'm not paying you $5,000. If you want to come to my house, you'll get a face full of lead." This was a complete bluff, though, as he doesn't actually own a gun, and the hacker likely knew that, because that same night, Joe received a follow-up email containing a picture of his house. It was the side of his parents' house and zoomed in on his bedroom window upstairs. He didn't want to tell his parents, in fear of worrying them, but now that his gun bluff didn't work, he knew he may have to get them or the police involved. He responded one more time, saying, "I don't have $5,000. I'm broke, paying off student loans. The house you sent a picture of is my parents' house. They did nothing wrong. If you need to do this, please do it to someone else. I don't have the money to send you even if I wanted to." There was no response this time, but within an hour, the sound of glass shattering from downstairs traveled throughout the house. Everyone, including his parents, heard it. There was one of their decorative bricks from the front of the house, laying in the dining room among thousands of tiny shards of glass from the broken window. Joe tried to explain the situation as quickly as he could, and while he and his dad took a quick look outside for anyone who could be out there, his mother called the police. Joe showed the police officers the emails and everything, which were forwarded to the police department. A police officer stayed parked outside the Albany's house for a couple of hours that night. Joe blocked the email address from sending any further emails, and as far as he knew, he was never contacted again. The police had a hard time tracing back the original source of the email, as it was sent from an untraceable device, likely an iPod Touch or similar device. Christian has a friend named Katie who was out for a job interview. They used to be co-workers, which is how they met. Nothing was out of the ordinary until Christian started to try and contact Katie after her interview was supposed to be done, only to find that his texts weren't delivering and calls were going straight to voicemail. It was very possible that her phone could have been off or she had no cell service. But as hours passed and still nothing was delivering, he started to get concerned. The most likely and obvious possibility was that she lost or broke her phone. But finally, hours later, the text said, "Delivered." However, Kate never replied. That same day, as Christian was checking his email, he saw an email from Katie's old work email. He opened it, and it read, "Hey, I lost my phone and keys. Can you come pick me up and by some old warehouse construction looking building in the parking lot across from a Hyatt Place?" Christian asked when she last had her phone and if she had any idea how she lost it. She replied, "I have no idea. Just come soon, please. It's cold." The address that she then sent to better help Christian get to her said it was 20 minutes away. But looking at the location of the address on the map, it led to some abandoned-looking warehouse parking lot, evident by the green growing in the parking lot and decaying-looking rooftop. Christian sent another email back demanding she go to a less sketchy pickup point. She took a few minutes to answer back with, "I'm already sitting on a bench here. I'm comfortable. Just please hurry." Christian got in his car and started following the directions to the location he was told to go. But about halfway there, he stopped the car when he had a thought, and that was, how is she using her laptop to email him in the middle of some random parking lot by an abandoned warehouse? While it was maybe possible that there was some free Optimum Wi-Fi nearby or something, it did seem very unlikely. This is where Christian became suspicious of the whole thing, and the fact that she was using her laptop to contact him instead of going to the hotel across the street and calling him just made it seem more suspicious. He tried calling her number a few times, and now it was ringing. Instead of going to voicemail on his third try, the phone rang twice, and somebody picked up for a second. Though most likely on accident. By this point, Christian was suspicious. All of Katie's things were stolen. He called Katie's brother to tell him about the situation and ask his opinion, but when he asked first thing, "Have you heard from Katie?" Katie's brother said she had been home for 2 hours and that her entire backpack and phone were stolen. Christian yelled into the phone that he was being led into some sketchy parking lot at that very moment by someone who was on Katie's email, most likely on her laptop. Christian drove to Katie's house immediately to pick the two of them up, and they called her phone and left a voicemail with all three of them yelling threats of what they'd do if they didn't return the phone and laptop, which probably went unheard if the thief didn't have her passcode. They also sent a number of texts which went unresponded to after calling the police and requesting assistance in the parking lot. A police car did show up, but the entire parking lot was abandoned as expected, and no further emails were received. Kate's phone was never turned on again. It was likely disposed of. She never got any of her stuff back. But on the bright side, Christian may have avoided being lured into some kind of trap that would have led to him being robbed or harmed. Back when I worked at Old Navy, I was on the processing team that typically worked the closing and night shift. That way we could make sure all of the shelves are neatly stocked up when the store opened in the morning. This was an amazing job and really wasn't that difficult. The store I worked at had all the pallets delivered before we even arrived. So we would just break down the boxes, sort and fold the clothes that had just been dropped off, and then made sure to fill out the shelves and change out whatever sales and markdowns that we were doing. And on the easier days, we even got to listen to our music. As long as it wasn't disruptive. Everyone I worked with was pretty cool too. So all in all, I love that job. But that's also where I had one of the craziest experiences I'll probably ever have. You see, I was working one evening and it was right before closing, so we still had a few people shopping in the store. I was spending a lot of my time in the back room doing an inventory and getting the carts filled with products that needed to hit the shelves. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first, but that took a turn really quickly. The store that I was working at happened to be across from a relatively small jewelry store, and unbeknownst to me and the people in the Old Navy, the store had just been robbed. It was probably around 8:30 at night when I heard the sound of a woman screaming from the front of the store, which of course caused me to drop what I was working on and begin to rush out of the storeroom. I was stopped, however, by a man who had been fleeing from the robbery and was clearly carrying a firearm. Everything happened so fast, I couldn't tell if it was a handgun or some sort of mini-automatic SMG of sorts. As soon as I saw the weapon in their hand, I froze. Luckily for me, the man just pushed me to the side as he continued to run through the back room. I ran out into the front of the store where everyone had already been in the process of evacuating, and once we were all out, I closed the front door and locked it, and we all waited patiently for the police to arrive. The response time of the officers was impressive, but by the time they arrived and made their way through the store, the man who had terrorized us was nowhere to be found. After speaking to one of the officers, it turned out that he robbed the jewelry store alone and in the process, actually shot one of the employees. It was at that moment I realized how lucky I was that when I came face to face with the gunman, I didn't meet the same fate. It took about an hour and a half for the police to fully check the store to a point where they were comfortably saying that the man had left the premises presumably through the back door. By that time, the store was ready to be closed up and the entire processing team was given the night off after the incident. Since none of us really wanted to be there at that moment, we finished cleaning the store really quick and then locked up before all of us headed home. Over the next couple of days, we had a few follow-up visits from the police who wanted to see our security footage, but other than that, there had been no sign of the man responsible, at least not for a couple of months. It was around the middle of June when we noticed that our AC unit wasn't functioning as well as it used to, and after making a few calls, we had an HVAC contractor come and take a look at it, and it wasn't long before she found the problem. We notified the police of what she found right away, and they were at the store in no time, along with paramedics. It turned out that the robber never made it out of the store. he must have found a way to squeeze into the air ducts and try to hide out. However, he must have tried to go forward at one point while inside and ended up going into a duct that led straight down. Now, this ductile wasn't wide enough for him to turn his body, and he was in a position where he couldn't wedge himself back out of the duct the way that he came in. It's unclear how long it took, but the man ended up being stuck upside down in the duct, which likely caused him agonizing pain and discomfort until he ultimately passed away. The police recovered the body along with nearly $25,000 worth of jewelry in his pockets. One of the scariest moments of my life came just a few months before my 17th birthday. I was 16 years old and had just gotten my driver's license at the beginning of that summer, which meant that when I wasn't working my part-time job at McDonald's, I was usually driving around with my friends and family. As the summer came to an end, my mom asked a favor of me, which I happily accepted. She had asked me if I would take my younger sister to the local strip mall to get some clothes and supplies for the upcoming school year, and as I said, this wasn't an issue at all. I told my sister Mary that I would take her to get what she needed, and if she was good in the store, we could grab some ice cream afterward from my favorite stand. So when the time came, she was more than excited. We left our house around 4:30 in the afternoon, and the mall was only about a 25 miles drive, so we were there in no time, and to our surprise, finding a parking spot was quite easy as the lot was rather empty. Mary and I got out of my car and we started our trip by heading to the Target that was across the parking lot from the mall and picked up a couple notebooks and all of the required writing supplies for her. It was strange though, as we made our way through the store I couldn't help but feel like someone had been following us. This caused me to periodically look over my shoulder as me and my younger sister made our way up and down the aisle, and in my opinion I didn't see anything that would be considered out of the ordinary. There were a few other shoppers in the store, but other than that I didn't notice anything suspicious. I tried my best to remain calm and brush the strange feeling away so that I didn't concern Mary, but I sure was happy when we finished up in Target. We then made our way over to the Kohl's that was located in the strip mall to look for some new clothes for Mary. I told her that she could get anything that she wanted, so right away we began looking at some light-up shoes and other clothes that I too would have loved when I was a child. Honestly, back to school. Shopping with her that day would have been so much fun had I not continued to get that feeling. It hit me like a freight train, but as Mary tried on some clothes in the changing room, I again couldn't help but feel as if someone had been stalking me. This time I decided to call my mom and let her know that I was feeling a bit odd and wondered if I could head home with Mary after this. My mom understood the concern, but instead of telling me to cut the shopping trip short, she decided to come to the mall and finish up herself. She asked me to wait there and she would be there soon. I reluctantly agreed, but knowing her schedule, this was probably the only time that we would have been able to get Mary clothes and such, so it was the best option at the time, or so we thought. After finishing up in Kohl's, Mary still needed a few things and wanted to run by the Gap outlet store that was in the same plaza, so I texted my mom and told her to meet us there instead, and I cautiously walked my sister over to Gap with my head on a swivel the entire way. There was still no sign of anyone though the fact that it had begun to get dark out didn't make things any less stressful. The two of us went into Gap and began looking at some sweatshirts and jackets that were in a pretty good sale, and about 5 minutes after getting into the store, my mom texted me to let me know that she was pulling into the parking lot. I let Mary know that our mom was there, and she was so excited that she wanted to go outside and meet her. So I grabbed her hand and we made our way out of the store quickly, and as I made my way through the automated sliding doors, I was knocked to the ground. 3 men had swarmed the entrance of the store and began hitting me with a hail of fists and kicks as I dropped to the floor. That was when I heard Mary scream. I looked up and saw her in the arms of one of my attackers, who was now dragging my little sister away from me through the parking lot. She began to cry and flail about, but there was nothing I could do. As I was still being pummeled by 2 of the men, I thought I had lost her. That was when I heard 2 voices yelling, one of which I knew as my mother, who must have seen what was happening and was rushing to help. The other I didn't recognize. To my surprise, another man who had been shopping inside Gap saw what happened and ran out to assist us. He was followed by 3 employees who had been working at the time, and when the men saw all of the people coming to assist, they quickly gave up on their attack and ran off. The man who had taken my sister had dropped her. When it became too hard for him to get into the vehicle, she ran straight to my mother, who then ran to me, and law enforcement was on site within minutes. The 3 men who came after us that day were never apprehended or charged, at least not to our knowledge. When I was in my 20s, I was living in New York, about 40 minutes away from New York City. This was great because at the time I had actually been working in the city and would spend a lot of my time there, and the train ride to commute home really wasn't bad at all. All in all, I loved the city. But I would say that before I left, it seemed like every day it was getting more and more dangerous just to be walking around. And believe me when I tell you that no one is safe from it. It was the middle of April, and I'd just gotten off work and had to run some errands before heading home. So I found myself walking around the city, just hitting up a few stores that were only a block or 2 from the office, and after a long day at work, I figured that it wouldn't hurt to grab a small bite to eat and a beer before heading home. It was Friday, after all, so I did just that. I went into one of the bars that I enjoyed eating at every now and then, and the sign referred to the bar as a tavern, which I thought was awesome, and I ordered some mozzarella sticks, fries, and a drink. By the time I finished my meal, it was around 7:30 at night, and I figured I should probably head back home before things got too crazy. If you know New York City, you'll know that on the weekends it can get super packed with people. On my way to the subway that would bring me to the train transfer station, though I ended up having to use the bathroom, I looked around and saw a small outlet store and decided to run in and ask if they had a restroom. I was surprised to see the store was practically empty. There seemed to be a single employee working, and they were busy putting clothes away when they saw me. They must have known I needed to use the bathroom by the expression on my face, because he just gestured toward a door in the back, which I presumed was the restroom. I was right, and I walked in and I noticed a single stall and a urinal. I ran over to the urinal and began to relieve myself when out of nowhere I heard the door of the stall throw itself open, and before I could even zip my pants up, I could feel a gun being pressed into my back. The man told me not to move and that this would be quick, and then began running his hands through my pockets. He grabbed my wallet, my personal cell phone, and my work cell phone. It was at that moment that I truly began to freak out, and the man must not have liked me fidgeting around, because out of nowhere a loud popping noise went off and all I could hear was a ringing in my ear. I had been shot. I dropped to my knees. I hadn't noticed the pain yet, but I could feel the heat coming out of the wound in my back. I attempted to pivot my body in order to face my attacker, but at that moment I heard the sound of 2 more gunshots. My vision began to fade and soon everything was black. I remember waking up to the employee putting pressure on my wound and panicking, telling me that help was coming. I managed to hold on until the paramedics arrived on the scene, and thankfully I walked away from the incident with only a bit of physical therapy required. Following my recovery, the police pulled the footage of the man exiting the store quickly after shooting me. It's believed the only reason he didn't get the employee on his way out was that he was hiding behind the shelf stocking clothes. The man who mugged me was arrested 2 months later following another robbery that he attempted in the same area. I never saw any of the stuff that he took from me again, though, but I suppose it could have been much worse.